I received the email and I want to know exactly what I am lacking. I need clarity, something that would explain what happened.
Mr. Carter, it was all about alignment.
What do you mean? What do I need to improve on?
I worked at that company for 8 years, and for most of that time I believed something simple, something almost comforting, that if you kept your head down, did your job well, and stayed loyal, eventually it would pay off, because that is what we are taught to believe, that effort leads to reward and patience leads to progress, and for a long time I held on to that belief like it was the only thing keeping me grounded, but there was a moment, a very specific moment, when everything I thought I understood about work, about trust, about fairness, completely collapsed, and it started with something small, something ordinary, something most people would ignore, a sound, a machine running quietly in an empty office, a shredder, and inside that shredder were pieces of paper that were never meant to be seen again, pieces that carried names, decisions, judgments, and when I put them back together, slowly, carefully, obsessively, I realized that my promotion had never really been mine to earn. It had already been taken away long before I even walked into that interview, and the person who made sure of that was Rachel Whitmore, the head of HR, the same person who looked me in the eye and told me I just was not the right fit, the same person whose secrets I was now holding in my hands, and before we go any further let me say this clearly, if you have ever been passed over for something you deserved and could not explain why, stay with me, because this story might answer more than you expect. And before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because what I am about to tell you is not just a story about one company or one decision, it is a story about how quietly a system can shape your future without you ever realizing it, and how sometimes the truth only reveals itself when something goes wrong, when a machine jams, when a mistake is made, when something slips through the cracks. And my name is Daniel Carter, and this is what really happened. For 8 years I showed up before most people had even settled into their chairs. I learned the systems inside and out, I fixed problems that were not technically my responsibility, I trained new hires who would later outrank me, and I did all of it with the belief that consistency would eventually be recognized, that reliability would eventually be rewarded. And every year during reviews I was told the same thing in slightly different words, that I was doing everything right, that I was in a strong position, that my time was coming, and for a long time I accepted that, I believed it, because there was no reason not to, until the position opened up, operations manager, the role that sat directly above me, the role I had already been performing in pieces without the title or the pay, and when it became available, something shifted. Not just for me but for everyone around me. Co-workers started treating me differently, asking if I was ready, telling me it was obvious I would get it. Even leadership started including me in conversations that felt like preparation, and for the first time in years I allowed myself to think that this was real, that this was not just another cycle of waiting, that this was the moment everything I had worked for would finally align. I prepared for that interview like my future depended on it, because in many ways it did. I reviewed every project I had worked on, every metric I had improved, every problem I had solved. I practiced answers in my head during my commute. I imagined different scenarios, different questions, different ways the conversation might unfold, and by the time I walked into that room, I was ready, not just prepared but certain that I had earned this, that I had proven myself beyond any reasonable doubt. And the panel sat across from me, 3 people, 2 of whom I knew well, and one who watched more than she spoke, Rachel Whitmore, head of HR, someone whose presence always felt controlled, measured, precise, and during the interview she asked very little, she mostly observed, taking notes, watching closely, and at the time it felt routine, but looking back now, I realize it was something else entirely. It was evaluation based on criteria I did not yet understand, criteria that had nothing to do with the answers I was giving, and when the interview ended, I walked out feeling confident, not arrogant, just confident, because everything I had done pointed to one outcome, and for 3 days I waited. Those 3 days felt longer than they should have. Every notification on my phone caught my attention, every email felt like it could be the one, and I replayed the interview in my mind more times than I can count, not because I thought I did poorly but because I wanted to hold on to that sense of control, that belief that the outcome was still tied to something I had done, something I could understand. And then the email came, short, formal, detached, informing me that they had decided to move forward with another candidate, someone with less experience, someone I had trained, and in that moment something inside me shifted, not just disappointment but confusion, because it did not make sense, and when something does not make sense, it stays with you, it follows you, it refuses to let you move on, and I knew I needed answers, not reassurance, not comfort, answers. I went to Rachel's office that same day, not angry but determined. I needed clarity, something tangible I could work with, something that would explain what had happened, and she welcomed me in with that same calm expression, the same controlled tone, and when I asked her what I was lacking, she did not hesitate. She told me it was about alignment, and I remember that word clearly because it did not mean anything specific. It was vague, open-ended, impossible to measure, and I pressed further, asking what exactly that meant, what I needed to improve, what I could do differently, and she gave me variations of the same answer, polished, professional, but empty, and as I left her office, I realized something important. I was not being told the truth, I was being given something that sounded like the truth, and that difference would come to matter more than anything else. The days after that felt different in a way that is hard to describe. Everything looked the same but nothing felt the same, the routines, the conversations, the expectations, all of it continued as if nothing had happened, but I could not shake the feeling that something was off, and I started noticing things I had ignored before, patterns in how people moved through the company, how some advanced quickly while others stayed in the same place despite consistent performance, and at first it felt like coincidence, like the kind of randomness you expect in any workplace, but the more I paid attention, the more it started to form a pattern, one that I could not fully see yet but could definitely feel, and then came the night that changed everything. I stayed late that evening, not because I had to but because I could not bring myself to leave, not with so many unanswered questions. The office was quiet, almost empty, and as I walked past the HR department, I heard it, a low mechanical hum, steady and continuous, the sound of a shredder running, and it caught my attention because it was late, too late for routine paperwork, and something about it felt unusual. So I slowed down, glanced toward the partially open door, and after a moment of hesitation, I stepped inside. The room was empty, lights still on, everything in place except for the shredder, still running, and when I approached it, I noticed it had jammed, the paper stuck halfway through, and without thinking too much about it, I reached down and pulled the bin out, and that is when I saw the strips, and that is when everything began to change. At first it looked like nothing, just shredded paper, but then I noticed names, printed clearly across multiple strips, structured information, not random documents, and curiosity took over. I gathered as many pieces as I could, telling myself I was just trying to clear the jam, just trying to understand what had gone wrong, but deep down I knew it was more than that. I knew I was crossing a line. And still I could not stop. I took the pieces home that night, spread them out across my table, and started to piece them together slowly, carefully, and when my name appeared among the fragments, everything else faded, because now it was personal, and what I reconstructed that night was not a standard HR document, it was something else entirely, a system, a classification, a hidden layer of decision-making that existed beneath everything I thought I understood. And next to my name was a word that would stay with me long after that night, liability. And that was only the beginning, because once you see something like that, you cannot ignore it, you cannot pretend it does not exist, and the more I looked, the more I found, patterns in behavior, patterns in outcomes, connections that started to form between people who advanced and people who did not, and slowly, quietly, the picture became clearer, not all at once but piece by piece. And what it revealed was something far more calculated than I ever expected, something that explained not just my situation but the entire structure of how decisions were being made, and the deeper I went, the more I realized that what I found in that shredder was not a mistake, it was evidence, and the question was no longer why I was denied the promotion, the question was how far this system went, and who else was affected by it, and whether exposing it would change anything at all or simply put me in a position I could not come back from, because sometimes the truth does not just reveal itself. It demands something in return, and I was about to find out exactly what that cost would be. What I did not understand that night, sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by thin strips of paper, was how deep this would go, because at first it felt contained, like something limited to a few documents, a few decisions, a few people, something that could be explained and maybe even corrected, but as I kept piecing the fragments together, matching edges, aligning fonts, reconstructing sentences one letter at a time, a larger picture began to form, and it was not clean, it was not simple. It was layered, deliberate, and structured in a way that suggested this was not a one-time thing, this was a system that had been in place for a long time, and I was only seeing a small part of it, and the more I reconstructed, the more I recognized names, people I worked with, people I had conversations with, people I had seen struggle to move forward despite doing everything right. And suddenly their situations made sense in a way that felt unsettling, because it meant their outcomes were not accidental, they were decided. I remember finding one entry that stood out, a coworker named Ethan Brooks, someone who had been with the company longer than I had, someone who consistently outperformed expectations but had never been promoted, and next to his name were notes that looked eerily similar to mine, references to conversations, observations taken out of context, small remarks turned into defining characteristics. And beside those notes was the same classification, liability, and I sat there staring at it longer than I should have, because it forced me to confront something I had not fully accepted yet. This was not personal in the way I initially thought, it was systematic, which somehow made it worse, because it meant this was happening to people who had no idea why they were being held back, people who would continue to blame themselves for something they could never fix, and as that realization settled in, I felt something shift from curiosity to responsibility, because now that I had seen it, I could not pretend it was not there. The next morning I went to work like nothing had changed, but everything had, every interaction felt different, every conversation carried weight, and I started listening more closely, not just to what people said but to what they avoided saying, the pauses, the hesitations, the careful wording, and I noticed that the people who seemed to move ahead were often the ones who kept things surface level, who did not question too much, who did not push back, while the ones who spoke openly, who raised concerns, who challenged decisions, seemed to remain exactly where they were, and it was not obvious, it was subtle, spread out over time, easy to dismiss if you were not looking for it, but once you saw it, you could not unsee it, and I began to understand that what I had found was not just about promotions, it was about control. I did not confront anyone immediately, not because I was afraid but because I needed to be sure, I needed more than fragments, more than reconstructed documents, I needed something undeniable, something that could not be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding, and so I started documenting everything, quietly, carefully, keeping track of conversations, noting patterns, comparing outcomes. And over the next few weeks, the consistency became impossible to ignore, people who had been labeled. In those documents followed predictable paths, not because of their performance but because of how they were categorized, and the realization that your future in that company could be determined by a private label you never even knew existed was something I struggled to fully process. There was a moment, about 2 weeks after I found the documents, when I almost stopped, when I told myself it was not worth it, that I should just move on, find another job, leave it behind, because the deeper I went, the more complicated it became, and the more I realized that exposing it would not be simple, it would not be clean, and it might not even lead to the outcome I expected. But then something happened that pulled me right back in, something small but significant, a conversation I overheard between two managers in the break room, one of them mentioning a name I recognized from the documents, someone who had recently been passed over for a promotion, and the way they spoke about it, casually, almost dismissively, referencing concerns that matched exactly what I had seen in those notes, concerns that had never been formally addressed, concerns that existed only in that hidden system. And in that moment it became clear, this was not just documentation, it was being actively used. That realization changed everything, because now it was not just about uncovering something hidden, it was about understanding how it influenced decisions in real time, and I knew I could not ignore it anymore, so I made a decision, one that I knew carried risk. I was going to confront Rachel again, but this time not with questions, with evidence. And the days leading up to that confrontation were some of the longest I can remember, not because I doubted what I had found but because I knew that once I brought it forward, there was no going back, and I spent hours going over everything, organizing the reconstructed documents, making sure every piece was aligned, every detail clear, because I needed it to be undeniable. When the day finally came, I walked into her office with a level of certainty I had never felt before, not confidence, not exactly, something heavier, something that comes from knowing you are about to challenge something much bigger than yourself, and she looked up as I entered, the same calm expression, the same controlled presence, and for a moment it felt like nothing had changed, like I was back to where I started, asking questions I would not get answers to, but this time was different. This time I placed the documents on her desk, slowly, deliberately, and I watched as her expression shifted, just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to see, and that was all I needed. I told her I knew what the classifications meant, that I understood how they were being used, that I had seen the patterns, and for a moment there was silence, the kind that feels longer than it actually is, and then she spoke, not with denial, not with anger, but with something else, something measured, and what she said in that moment stayed with me, because it changed the way I saw everything that followed. She said, "You were not supposed to see that," and there was no panic in her voice, no urgency, just a simple acknowledgement, and it was in that moment that I realized she was not reacting the way someone would if they had been caught doing something wrong, she was reacting like someone who knew exactly how this would play out. I asked her directly, how long this had been happening, how many people were affected, and she did not answer the question, not directly. Instead she said something that made everything even more complicated. She said, "You think this is just me," and that question hung in the air, because it shifted the focus, it suggested something larger, something beyond her, and for the first time since I started uncovering all of this, I felt uncertainty, not about what I had found but about what it meant. Because if she was not the source, if she was just part of something bigger, then exposing her alone would not change anything, and that realization made the situation far more complex than I had anticipated. I left her office that day without the resolution I thought I would get, but with a new understanding. This was not a single point of failure, it was a network, a structure that extended beyond one person, one department, one set of documents, and that meant the next step was not as simple as reporting her, it required something more, something that could address the system as a whole. And that is when I decided to take everything I had gathered to corporate compliance, not because I believed they would fix it immediately, but because it was the only path that could potentially reach beyond the surface. The process that followed was slow, deliberate, and at times frustrating, because investigations like that do not move quickly, they require verification, documentation, review, and for weeks I heard very little, just occasional updates that things were being looked into, that more information was being gathered, and during that time, the environment at work began to shift in subtle ways. Rachel's presence became less consistent, meetings were rescheduled, conversations were more guarded, and while nothing was said openly, there was a sense that something was happening beneath the surface. Then one day, without announcement, without explanation, Rachel was gone, her office cleared, her name removed from directories, and no one addressed it directly, no official statement, no acknowledgement, just an absence where there had once been a constant presence, and for a moment it felt like something had been resolved, like the system had corrected itself, but that feeling did not last, because the more I thought about it, the more I realized that removing one person did not necessarily Dismantle the structure she was part of, and that question remained: how much of it was still in place, how much had actually changed? I did not stay long after that, not because I was pushed out but because I could not continue in the same way knowing what I knew, because once you understand how decisions are made behind closed doors, it changes how you see everything, it changes how you interpret feedback, how you evaluate opportunities, how you trust the process, and I realized that staying would mean accepting a system I no longer believed in, and that was not something I was willing to do. Before we go, subscribe if you haven't already, it means a lot to us. Looking back now, what stays with me is not just the outcome, not just the fact that I was denied a promotion or that I uncovered something hidden, it is the realization of how easily something like that can exist without being questioned, how many people can be affected without ever knowing why, and how important it is to pay attention to the things that do not quite make sense. Because sometimes those are the moments where the truth is closest to being revealed, and sometimes all it takes is one small disruption, one unexpected mistake, one jammed machine, to bring it to the surface.